Hey guys, let's talk about comic books and graphic novels. What a concept on this channel, right? So we're going to talk about what is a graphic novel. This is not even the correct term to use, right? Most people think a graphic novel is a big comic book. Sorta, right? There's many terms in this industry between trade paperbacks and graphic novels. What's the distinction? I used to care a lot about that, but I don't think it matters that much anymore. So we'll call, for the purposes of this video, we're going to treat OGNs, original graphic novels, and trade paperbacks, which are usually collected comics. We'll kind of treat them the same way. For the most part, Marvel and DC don't do very many OGNs. Like, they don't come out with a single book of hundreds of pages of a single story. They serialize, right? They put out individual issues. They sell those, oftentimes with multiple covers, which we'll talk about for sure. And eventually collect those into trade paperback form, which is considered sort of the more evergreen format of many comics. The problem is they're far from evergreen. The problem is they're not being written to be consumed in that novelized format. They're being written in a way that doesn't really suit serialized comics anymore and is not great for collections either. It's sort of this no man's land that produces works that, in my opinion, are not of lasting, rereadable quality for the most part, right? For the most part. There's no doubt in my mind that DC is far ahead of Marvel as far as the perennial trade paperback graphic novel market. There's just a lot more books over a longer period of time that hold up as graphic novels that can be reread again and again. A lot of this is due to investments that DC made in the 80s into more mature storytelling and storylines. From Swamp Thing, which led into Vertigo, and The Sandman, and The Watchmen, and so many other things. DC had a commitment. As a matter of fact, one of their big slogans of the 80s was, wow, DC Comics not for kids anymore. This was the beginning of the end, in my opinion. See, comics had to outlive this reputation as utter juvenilia, right? As stuff for kids. It had this reputation. The term something written like a comic book was a synonym, basically, for comics being written for a younger or less literate audience. It didn't mean that nobody really took the concept that comics were for were to be written for adults. They were for kids, right? And this was sort of the albatross around the neck of the comics industry for so long. Guys who came up in the 70s and 80s especially, who became professional cartoonists and writers and artists of comics, struggled hard against this perception. And that makes sense, right? They probably grew up reading comics, maybe superhero comics, maybe kids comics, whatever, and sort of yearning for something a little more, realizing that this medium of comics was not meant just for children, and in fact could be used to tell the most adult, most sophisticated stories that you can imagine, right? So, especially folks like Will Eisner was a champion of this. That's why the Eisner Awards are named after this guy. He took stories and wrote stories about real people in real life adult situations, and he even coined the term graphic novel, as far as I know, right? These were all great things. I'm not going to denigrate these things. I'm not going to look down on Alan Moore's work on Swamp Thing. I'm not going to look down on Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. Although there's things that we could say about both of those works and the influence that they had on what came immediately after could be considered not very positive, right? I think both Miller and Alan Moore, who probably almost definitely don't see eye to eye creatively, right? both sort of bemoaned the fact that in the wake of their groundbreaking works in 1984, Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, comics sort of took the wrong lesson from that and started going in this dark, grim, and gritty direction without adding any of the sophisticated adult themes really that were there. They were just sort of, comics got sort of splattered in the trappings of blood and gore and other things that, if you really read Dark Knight Returns or Watchmen or any of those, higher quality, higher caliber books of the 80s, you realize that's not really the goal necessarily that they were going for. Although I'll bet, if you ask Alan Moore, he's going to look at Dark Knight Returns and call that a work of fascist literature. And in many ways, I agree that there are fascist themes to it, just as there are some fascist themes in Watchmen. And as a matter of fact, I've been thinking about an idea for a video coming up pretty soon, talking about the inherent fascist nature of the superhero genre, right? Because let's take a quick sidebar into genre versus medium, right? A lot of people know this, but a lot of people don't, right? A genre is a type of story. A medium is a form of a story. So comics themselves, words and pictures sequentially on a page, usually sequentially, that's a medium. Comics are a medium which can be used to express stories, nonfiction or fiction, of any genre, so any type. Unfortunately, the genre that dominates or that dominated mainstream comics has always been superheroes, which, if you think about it, superheroes really are a subset of maybe science fiction and fantasy sort of mixed together. But they have their own tropes, of course, that we all know. I don't need to talk about superhero tropes like secret identities and solving problems with violence. I'm going to save all that for another video because I have a lot of thoughts that I haven't fully put together yet. So why am I even talking about this? Well, here's why. Because many people thought in the 80s that after the 80s and into the 90s that this was the way. Adult comics meant more violent superhero comics or horror comics or what have you. Turns out there's always has been another way, right? And you can check out, this guy named Matt T had an excellent video on this very subject where he goes in depth on Jeff Smith and Bone and how he changed everything. Now, I remember when Bone dropped in my comic shop. We were buying Bone in my store from issue 1, and we were all into it, right? Even me as a kid and the adults in the store, anybody who really loved comic storytelling, the medium, and had an openness to things outside of the superhero genre, could instantaneously see that Bone was something special, right? Just looking at the art style and the way that Jeff Smith drew and paced, specifically how he paced his comics, the amounts of quiet and noisy panels and small panels versus large panels and how that extends time, betrayed his animator background. But you could also see that you could see his influences. He kind of wore them on his sleeve. I mean, while it didn't look like a copy of anything, it was undeniably influenced by some of the Barks books, maybe even some Carl Barks, of course, Uncle Scrooge, Donald Duck, the King of Ducks, but also a master of pacing and storytelling, and specifically all ages storytelling. Meaning, this was a story that kids loved and read and enjoyed, but so can adults. This is the difference between kids comics and all ages comics. And there's a big difference, and there's lots of both now. And this is the thing that makes me extremely happy, right? When I bought my comic book store back in, it must have been 2001, the comic store I grew up as a kid, I had already been converted to this graphic novel revolution. That's the format that I most enjoyed reading comics in, for the utility, the ability to store them on a shelf with the spine out, easily access and reread them, just something I love to do. Collecting and opening plastic bags and tape I have millions of comics, but that wasn't the part that I really enjoyed. And collectible comics and having the most expensive back issues, sometimes I had expensive back issues, but only because they contained a crucial story, plot, or point that I really wanted, and there was no other way to get it back then, right? So you would go seek out back issues, you'd go around, you'd hunt down back issues, and man, I hunted down many, and I really enjoyed it. Series like that have never been collected, it's still the only way. Things like Bill Willingham's Elementals comes to mind, or there's many issues of The Flaming Carrot, or other comics that the only way to find them is in the bins. And that's fine for what it is. But graphic novels are the thing. And the problem with graphic novels, as far as Marvel, especially Marvel, but Marvel and DC are concerned, is that their storytelling is very, for the most part, mind you, this is 90%, it's not worth preserving for the ages, right? There's only so many Marvel and DC stories that are really, really good enough that you would take it and just recommend it to someone to read by itself. Like they're not a superhero fan or a fan of that particular character. You say, hey, here's a great book. Most of those are DC. Most of them, for sure. Like books that I already talked about, a lot of the Vertigo stuff. Much of the superhero canon, the individual monthly issues are not and never were that good. They have some incredible art, oftentimes have some good stories. There are great stories out there in that genre, just not that many. The vast majority of them are kind of forgettable dreck, right? Go back and read issues of West Coast Avengers from the 80s, right? Like these have been reprinted now, and some people still buy them out of nostalgia or what have you, or because they have a connection to the movies in some way, but they were not great, right? They left you wanting something. So back to Bone. Bone, when it came out, was a revelation. Anybody who really understood comics could see the influence. They could see the Walt Kelly's Pogo. They could see the Duck influence there. And maybe if you looked closer, you would see some of the true influences like Lord of the Rings, or even underground stuff like Von Bode's Cheech Wizard and stuff like that, stylistically and thematically, were right in the Bone wheelhouse, right? Bone took all ages funny looking characters and plopped them in a dark fantasy setting and told an epic tale. One that kids really bought into and adults could read and enjoy with enthusiasm. I think a lot of it is due to the design of Bone, the Bone characters themselves, who are impeccably drawn by Smith. They lack a lot of distinguishing characteristics. They are very bright. Bone, he's all white, kind of puffy, and that's it, right? Very nondescript. But I believe that design, that specific design, and taking those characters and putting them in a world that's illustrated a little more richly and more detailed than these characters, provides for enhanced reader identification, especially among kids. This is one of the big reasons why we respond to manga characters, which I'm going to talk about a lot in a second, and other characters that are more further on the cartoony side of the spectrum than on the realistically rendered side of the spectrum, right? Scott McCloud talks about it in Understanding Comics, and he's got his pyramid of, realism and representational artwork. And there's just this sweet spot, right? Where things look real enough that you can tell what they are, but are obviously not real. And this is the realm of the cartoon. This is where Jeff Smith and many cartoonists, especially on the newspaper side of things, really tended to excel. These are characters that let you highly identify, let you be the character, right? I mean, humans, our minds are so graphically wired that you can take a circle and put a smiley line and 2 dots on it, and we instantaneously recognize that as a face, right? Like even tiny children are going to recognize that because it's hardwired into us. It's not something we learn, it's something we are, right? And it's this kind of reader identification that lets you plug into simplified cartoon characters and really make them real. Combine that with what McLeod also talked about as far as closure, the fact that you're filling in the action in between still panels. It's different than animation, right? Animation uses time to tell a story. Comics use space in the way that animation uses time. Very fascinating. We could talk about that some other time too. I could go off on that forever, but I'm digressing a lot. What do I really want to talk about is how Bone got picked up by Scholastic Books, became a worldwide hit with kids and adults, but mostly kids all over the world, fully colorized what was originally a black and white book and took it to superstar status. And in the wake of Bone, we started seeing Scholastic blow up as a juggernaut of graphic novels, specifically for kids, right? Most of what Scholastic has sort of put out in the wake of Bone doesn't really touch Bone in terms of being truly an all ages experience. I mean, anybody can read Raina Telgemeier's work, and I highly recommend you do. Or Dog Man or Captain Underpants or any of these graphic novels that have, I mean, you've heard of these. These have taken over. These are the comics that kids are reading. Kids are not reading, for the most part, Marvel or DC comics. They like the movies, they like the cartoons, but for whatever reason, they don't need the comics. Maybe it's because this whole canon, you say, oh man, there's 50, 60, 70 or more years of stories from these guys. But each one, I mean, they span such a long era, multiple eras, right? Multiple generations they spanned. So it becomes really, really hard for a kid of today to get into, say, comics written in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Just, it was a different style. The writing style was way different. The art style was way different. And the characters have evolved to such a point that the old stuff seems kind of corny to kids who are raised on MCU and DC movies. On the other hand, they were encouraged at book fairs and by their teachers. Finally, I waited my whole life to be encouraged to read a comic book by teachers. They wouldn't let me. I tried to do Watchmen as a book report in high school, and I even offered to write it twice as long to talk about the art as well as the writing, and my teacher flat out denied it. There was no convincing her that a comic book was worthy of dissecting in that way, certainly not in an educational setting. Oh man, how things have changed. Not only are graphic novels considered adult fare now, I think most English teachers or most teachers in general would agree that with me, my saying is that anything that encourages kids to read is a good thing, and that kids who love comics are kids that love reading, right? That is such an easy connection to make, so easy and so borne out by the people. If you know people that really were into comics as a kid, they maintained a lifelong love of reading, right? They didn't just only care about juvenilia or whatever. Maybe some did. But they developed a lifelong love of reading because comics tap in so well, so easily to that young adolescent brain. And just offer a love of reading and telling stories that you're not seeing in a lot of other places. Especially when I was young, there was not many places to get, say, a good superhero story, right? You could watch the Batman TV show, but man, that wasn't Batman in the comics. For sure, it was a totally different thing. So where are we in 2025? Okay, Scholastic dominates the charts. Marvel and DC, I think combined, are about 4% of the graphic novel sales in this country. Another something like 40% is Scholastic and all ages books, and then the rest is dominated by the juggernaut that is manga and Japanese comics, right? Why did those succeed where Marvel and DC have objectively failed to dominate in the bookstore market the way they did in the pamphlet and periodical market, right? Superheroes rule in that world. Well, it's because the comic book floppy world, right? The individual pamphlet issues have become something else. They are now so expensive and often are presented with in a bewildering way with multiple variant covers that are harder to get, 1 in 100, 1 in 20. These are collectible tropes. These are things for collectors. These have nothing to do with reading. Well, sure, Dan, people should be allowed to enjoy whatever covers they want on comics, right? Like, how can you be that guy that judges and say there shouldn't be multiple covers? I guess I'm not, but the way they've used these, the way the comics industry uses these is so desperate to prop up sales. It's the only way they're achieving anything in the way of high numbers on sales is because they offer so many variant comics that are rare and collectible that you have to buy 100 copies of the regular issue in order to get one of these that you can hopefully flip to your customers or on eBay or somewhere else to make up for it. It's a terrible business, super wasteful, even more wasteful than the old days of newsstand distribution of comics where they had to throw away and strip covers off of comics and return them. See, comics are non-returnable. If a comic book store buys a comic book from a distributor, they're stuck with it. They have to sell it or they got to eat it, right? So this has made the comic book business extremely risk-oriented, right? They have to be risk-averse. This leads to cutting down on the number of titles. This leads to concentrating only on the biggest number of sellers, which forces the small and indie comics, marginalizes them, and it's sort of left the best storytelling behind in favor of this collectible market. Now, every once in a while, you're going to get good comics out of that market because there's good creators out there that still want to tell some of these stories. So you still get some good Marvel and DC books now and again. I probably couldn't tell you one on the stands at this particular moment, but they're still out there. There's still lots of really vibrant, great creators. However, there's no doubt in my mind that going forward, the future generations of people that are really into comics, that become cartoonists, I think a lot of those are going to be coming from the Scholastic world and the all ages world. Thanks to Bone, thanks to Diary of a Wimpy Kid, thanks to Dog Man, thanks to all these things that tell kids that they can tell stories and they don't have to be realistically rendered. They don't have to be hard on themselves because they can't draw like Neil Adams or whoever the kids would want to draw like today. They can just tell stories that are fun and funny and enjoyable. And man, they sell. These things sell tremendously. I'm talking 10, 20, 100 to 1 over what Marvel graphic novels and comics are selling. Incredible. And if you haven't turned your kids onto these or a young person or even picked one up yourself, I highly recommend it. Start with Bone because you're not going to be disappointed, and read it maybe with a kid, and it's something that a really special type of story that you can really enjoy. Epic fantasy storytelling that a kid can enjoy. And yeah, there's scary parts and there's monsters and there's fights, but there's also just fun and humor and so many things mixed together in a sort of a refreshing, palate cleansing way when you read a comic like Bone, right? It's not like the grim and gritty superhero comics, or ones that are so wrapped up in 50 years of continuity and back issue stories that you can't really understand them without being an expert. These are the comics created for beginning readers and beginning comics readers, and I can guarantee that these are what are going to spawn an entire new generation of cartoonists. Right? When they grow up, they're going to take these sensibilities and these feelings that they remember as a kid, and they can turn them into new stories. Whether they're for kids or adults, they're going to come through a different lens. And when it comes to kids reading Japanese comics, I think it's fantastic because the Japanese have so many genres of storytelling that superhero is not even 1% of what they're telling. They are a lot of fantasy, lots of sci-fi, but lots of slice of life stuff too. You can read Japanese comics about being a baker, about being a politician, about being a basketball player, about anything anybody could be into. You can find a Japanese comic about it. And this is why they are dominating our market. And this is why I predict 20 years from now, if movies still exist, when you go to the movies, it's going to be, the nostalgia wave is going to be all about Pokemon, and it's going to be about One Piece, and it's going to be about Inuyasha, and it's going to be about all the incredible Japanese series that have dozens upon dozens of volumes at an affordable price that kids can pick up at any bookstore and find anywhere, and not have to worry about collectible nonsense, not have to worry about the alternate cover on this comic costing 10 or 20 times more than the other one. They're reading it because they enjoy them and they love them. No other reason. This is what creates comic fans, and this is especially what creates cartoonists. Okay, hey, thanks. Thanks for listening to this. I am so enjoying the freedom of this new format. I'm getting some viewers too, and I'm really like that. I love your comments. So if you have comments about comics, why do you think Scholastic and manga are over 90% of the graphic novel market in the United States? Why have Marvel and DC, with this rich legacy of stories and the hugest movie franchise of the past decade, why can't they seem to capitalize that on the bookstore market? I'll talk about this a little bit in another video, I think. I just want to say one final thing. This is what a lot of people, I'll bet, will say. Maybe if you made it this far in the video, then you care about comics, and maybe you don't agree with what I have to say, and you're going to tell me something. You're going to say, hey, Dan, it's all those woke comics. It's when Marvel went woke and started race and gender swapping all their characters that things really went down the tubes. I'm going to shock you. I agree a little bit, and I disagree a lot, right? Because race and gender swapping is something that they've done in comics for a long time, right? We had Black Green Lanterns, and we've had other characters step in to fill the shoes of well-known superheroes, for some for short periods of time, some for longer. What Marvel made the mistake, and they did this while I still owned a comic store, right at the tail end. They had this Marvel Now initiative where right after the Avengers movie was this gigantic hit, and finally everybody knew who Thor and Captain America and Iron Man and the Hulk, and they knew these characters. Well, they took every single one of those characters and swapped them all at the same time, so that if you walked into my comic book store and wanted to buy Captain America, it was not the Captain America from the comics. It was Sam Wilson, who now is the Captain America from the movies. If you went in and wanted the Hulk, well, it was not Bruce Banner. It was, who was it? Amadeus Cho or something like that, right? They swapped everybody at the same time as sort of one giant storyline, right at the moment when we needed super recognizable versions of those characters in the comic shops. Kids would come in, they loved Captain America, and they looked for what they know as Captain America and they didn't see it. Were they responding because they didn't want a black guy being Captain America? No. They were responding because they wanted Captain America to be Captain America, right? So this has nothing to do with race swapping per se, and it had everything to do with the quality of those stories that were being told, right? They were just not being written at an engaging level and were not recognizable for this humongous market that you would open the gateway for. It caused cognitive dissonance. Meanwhile, a kid who's watching Japanese anime and goes to pick up the manga is going to be instantly rewarded with recognizing who those characters are, right? Instantaneous recognition, and they could be plugged right into that medium and that genre that they enjoy so much. So I really think Marvel dropped the ball in this way and let down a whole generation that they could have hooked into comics. The truth is they don't make as much money off the comics as they do by straight licensing toys and underwear and everything else that you see everywhere. We're surrounded by Marvel and DC products now, no matter where you go, in a mall or whatever. So granted, that was the sweeter plum, but I really believe they dropped the ball in creating that next wave of fans that are going to identify and love the comics as much as people from my generation did. Oh well, what are you going to do? Things change, times change. I'm happy that we got what we got. I'm happy to see that comics, at least finally, the medium of comics finally being recognized as something that is pro-literacy and good for kids to read, and something that we want to encourage. So no matter what your kid wants to read, no matter what kind of comics, encourage them to read those comics, because kids that love comics are kids that love reading. So speaking of love, I love that you watched this video. If you watched this far, if you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, you could give it a thumbs down. Just maybe add a comment in there. Tell me what I could talk about differently that would be more interesting to you. I look forward to talking to you about many, many subjects in the future. So please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.